Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Classroom, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy, and we are now on Lecture 9, Thomas Malthus and James Mill. Let me give my frequent apologies for this course where I'm going to say to you, I'm going to do a grave injustice by going through these two very important thinkers in a scandalous amount of time. But again, with the vagaries of the course schedule, I thought it's better to give you a little bit of both of these important thinkers than to ignore them. So, Thomas Malthus, 1766 to 1834. Some brief biographical remarks. So he was an English cleric, a political economist and demographer, a founding member of the Political Economy Club. His pessimistic views on population growth survive today as the term Malthusian. All right, so if you hear someone refer to a person's having a Malthusian worldview or saying, oh, that's a Malthusian policy recommendation, that, of course, goes back to the word Malthus, meaning it's derived from what he did in this essay that we're going to go over in a minute. However, I should say it's perhaps not fair. It's sort of like we'll find later that some people wonder whether Keynes was a Keynesian. By the same token, one might wonder whether Thomas Malthus and his actual views and policy recommendations would be considered Malthusian today. All right, I think it actually is fair that we use that term and the kind of people we apply it to, but nonetheless, I am just bringing that up, that as often happens, the originators of a framework are more nuanced than what later people believe in and the labels they apply to that legacy. Okay, so Malthus had a famous debate with David Ricardo where they argued about the scope and methods of political economy, and they also discussed this issue of a general glut. I'm going to come back to that concept and the just general controversy on that issue at the end of this lecture. Malthus's major works, an essay on the principle of population, that was 1798, the first edition, and Principles of Political Economy, 1820. So I don't want you to walk away from this thinking that all Malthus ever did was write this one essay on population growth, and that was his contribution to economics. That's not true. Malthus was a classical economist, so he did write a whole book on the principles of political economy, just like some of the other ones did from this era that we're studying. And he had all sorts of views, disputes with other famous classical economists, but given the constraints we have, I'm going to just focus now on his thoughts on population dynamics, since that's obviously what he's most famous for. Okay, so what was Malthus's purpose in writing this? Well, if you go to the preface of his essay on population, and I've included the preface and large chunks of the introductory chapter in the course notes, you'll see that he was responding to, quote, speculations on the perfectibility of man and society, end quote, that he had found in David Hume, Adam Smith, and other writers whose names you might not recognize. Okay, so big picture, Malthus thought he was writing in the tradition that Smith had erected, and he liked a lot of what Adam Smith had to say. It's not that he so much thought Smith was wrong, but Malthus thought that perhaps Smith was being too optimistic, or at least that Smith was overlooking a huge component of the analysis, and that Smith's work on the benefits of free trade and, hey, look at how great industry and thrift are in terms of savings and investment and accumulation of capital, all those trends and forces could be offset by thinking about population growth and the pressures that puts on a society. All right, so he didn't think he was saying Smith was wrong or overturning Smith. Malthus thought that the speculations of Hume and Smith, where they thought they could make man and society become ever better and more agreeable, that, well, I'm not so sure. We at least got to take into account population growth. All right, so let's focus now on the exact mechanism and what was this principle of population. So if you go and read the excerpts that I've given you, you'll see that he first focuses on population growth. And he looks at plants and animals and germs and thinks it's pretty well established that if you take any of those species and put them into an environment where there's no external check, that they're going to grow pretty quickly. And in particular, they're going to grow, you might say exponentially. Malthus uses the term geometrically, right? Meaning that it's a constant rate of growth. So it doubles every such and such years, for example. Again, if there's no external check on it. And so he goes through and establishes that and says the same thing with humans, that without these external checks, they too, their population numbers also would grow geometrically. Then he turns his attention to the growth in food production, and he focuses on units of subsistence. All right, so he's saying, like, how much food would it take to keep a human being alive for the year, and then how many units of that amount of food could we produce per year? Okay, so he's trying to show how many humans could we support in terms of food production. And then he goes through all kinds of speculations and considerations of various places in the world and their scope for improving agricultural output. And he says, okay, yeah, maybe we could, for a certain period, have a lot of innovation and take the cutting edge methods that we use, for example, in England, and apply them in places right now where they sort of have backward methods of production and therefore boost the yield per acre, that kind of stuff. And maybe we could double food production, but we couldn't then do that again. Okay, so however long it would take us to double food production by being really ingenious and industrious and so forth, we couldn't then perform the same feat in the same amount of time again, so that we would have 4 times as much total food production as we have right now. He's saying that you might say diminishing marginal returns would kick in, but he doesn't obviously use that phrase. All right, so he then takes those 2 trains of thought, and again, if you're not reading it, let me just tell you, he picks the numbers and the arguments to make it sound like he's bending over backwards to be very conservative, that with the population growth, he's erring on the side of modesty, and with food production, that he's erring on the side of wild optimism, because then he ends up concluding like this. So now I'm quoting, saying he was conducting a thought experiment. He says, the human species would increase as the numbers 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, and subsistence as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so there he's showing that the population, if left unchecked, would keep doubling over a certain period, whereas the amount of food production measured in units of subsistence would only increase arithmetically, only increase that, it would be 1, then maybe it would double that first period, going from 1 to 2, but it wouldn't double again. It would only go from 2 to 3, and then 3 to 4, and so on. In 2 centuries, the population would be to the means of subsistence as 256 to 9. In 3 centuries, as 4,096 to 13. All right, so again, what he's showing is the disparity in the amount of food per capita, the disparity arising because of the fact that the population is going to grow at a constant rate, whereas the food production, it's not at a constant rate. It's just the volume, the total amount of food might keep increasing by the same amount every time period, but that's going to imply a smaller and smaller rate of increase. And so thus, the amount of food per capita is going to keep shrinking. Okay, so what is the legacy now of that framework? All right, so Malthus himself, he's very nuanced. And so I'm going to say there's no specific policy conclusions that flow from his framework. But today I do want to make sure you understand, when people say Malthusian, what do they mean? They're saying somebody who thinks in terms of physical constraints and just worry. Like today's environmentalists, a lot of them have what we would call a Malthusian mindset. And so what do we mean when we say that? That they will be very concerned about, oh my goodness, how can GDP keep growing at this rate? And unbridled capitalism is going to soon butt up against the Earth's carrying capacity. And can the land support so many people? And can the oceans support all of our waste products? And how can the environment possibly keep up with man's rapacious appetite? And just he always wants more and more consumer products, right? So that kind of mentality today we would call Malthusian. All right. So again, it's Malthus himself was much more nuanced, right? So he was just showing in the earlier arguments that we went over, he was not necessarily saying there's going to be widespread famine. What he was trying to say, though, is clearly it's not going to work if you just have unchecked population growth at the biological limit, because food cannot possibly increase at the same rate, at least over long stretches of time. And so what's going to happen? He's saying something else would have to happen to limit the population growth. So it could be famine, but it could be war, or it could be moral checks on population growth, meaning people could not procreate outside of marriage, and maybe they could delay the age of marriage so that a given family has fewer offspring on average, and so forth, right? So there's all sorts of things, you can bring in birth control, stuff like that, where the point is there could be all kinds of other ways of limiting population growth in order to come up with a different mechanism so it doesn't have to just be famine, right? Because in certain natural ecosystems, if you have like wolves and sheep or something, and there's no human intervention, you could have these massive booms and crashes in population figures. If you've ever seen like those predator prey kind of models of population. And so Malthus is saying we clearly don't want that. All right, so again, it's actually Malthus's views were pretty nuanced, and so just be careful about what you think of in terms of his conclusions. However, let me stress, Malthus was just flat out wrong, at least so far. All right, that if you look at per capita food production, it has increased greatly since the time he was writing, and population has also increased greatly. All right, so it's not as if all of a sudden population only started growing linearly since the time he wrote, and so food production has managed to stay ahead of the population curve, if that's the way you want to talk about it. So you could just tweak his framework and say, oh, okay, so he was just pessimistic about that initial period of like going from 1 to 2 in terms of food output, and he just had his numbers calibrated wrong, and eventually it'll kick in. But more optimistic people like Julian Simon, who wrote in the 20th century, would say, well, no, why would we assume all of a sudden this innovation and the power of the human mind to overcome physical constraints, why would we think that would stop working? It's worked so far throughout human history. Why would we think all of a sudden we're going to run out of good ideas and that we'll suddenly have a shrinking amount of food per person? So it may be, for example, if you subscribe to that optimistic perspective, it might be that, yeah, at some point the earth would become too crowded, and that the way humanity would still have geometrically growing population with rising per capita food consumption would be that humans leave the earth and they go, colonize the moon and Mars or whatever. So maybe that's the way they'd solve it. But there are lots of modern day free market economists who think that although Malthus thought he was being very reasonable, he was just flat out wrong when he was saying there's no way we can imagine food production is going to continue to grow, at a certain rate over time. Eventually, it's going to have to level off, is what Malthus thought. Okay, let's switch attention now to James Mill, 1771 to 1836. So some biographical remarks on James Mill. And by the way, I'm going to keep saying James Mill instead of just his last name to drive home and make sure you don't get mixed up and think that I'm talking about John Stuart Mill, who's his son, and we're going to have a whole lecture on John Stuart Mill, who was much more famous. Okay, so James Mill was born in Scotland, moved to London where he was a freelance writer. He eventually ended up partially living off of Jeremy Bentham. All right, and Bentham was wealthy, and Mill was sort of hanging around it. And I don't mean to suggest that he was like a loafer or a freeloader. On the contrary, according to Rothbard at least, James Mill was a Lenin who was always seeking his marks, and that he thought he had one in the form of Bentham and then also David Ricardo. Okay, so that, in other words, Mill was like the sort of systematic, practical person who was more organized, and Bentham and Ricardo were sort of the geniuses who were, had all this output, and that we today remember as being the famous ones developing all these doctrines. But behind the scenes, actually, according to Rothbard again, James Mill was like the organizing force. So again, just to point out, James Mill's son was John Stuart Mill, and James tutored him at home. Okay, and so you could argue that one of James Mill's most, his magnum opus was his son. Right, that he put a lot of his effort into his son. So it's kind of interesting that James Mill, in many respects, you could say was a very selfless person, and what was really important to him was not the fame and the glory. He just had these ideas. He loved liberty, and he thought, okay, the way I'm going to best spread this is not by me trying to be famous and hogging the spotlight, but by getting Bentham and Ricardo, get them publishing and make sure the world finds out about their works, and do what I can to organize them and tutor them and so forth. And then, of course, putting all sorts of effort into raising my son to make sure he understands this wonderful framework that we've gotten from the previous writers. Okay, but looking at James Mill, three of his major works, he wrote something called Commerce Defended in 1808, Elements of Political Economy, 1821, and a 6-volume History of British India, which came out in 1826. All right, so let's just focus briefly on some of James Mill's contributions. And if you're looking at the PowerPoint, you see I've got a picture of a coach with a bullhorn. So that's just to jog my memory to say I'm going to now talk about things that, were not just contributions besides him being the cheerleader and coach and teacher for those other three more famous figures that I talked about. All right, so the notion of comparative advantage. So historians of economic thought now think that what we typically would call Ricardo's law of comparative advantage may actually have originated with James Mill, who would have then taught it to Ricardo. All right, so it's a bit murky, but the point is, in a typical discussion of the history of economic thought that's somewhat superficial, you will learn that David Ricardo took Adam Smith, who talked about free trade and had examples and arguments that relied on absolute advantage, and that Ricardo then generalized it. All right, so we're going to talk more about this when we do the lecture on Ricardo, but it won't hurt for me to anticipate that just a little bit, and repetition's always good in a course like this. So Adam Smith, when he was giving numerical examples and just general principles to try to get people to see why it would make sense for your nation to get rid of trade barriers with other nations, he would rely on what we would nowadays call absolute advantage. So the idea would be, well, gee, if France could produce bottles of wine with a smaller number of hours of French labor than England could produce with hours of labor from English workers, well, then that would be crazy for the English to create that wine domestically, right? It would make more sense, like if the English could make sweaters, more sweaters per hour of English labor than the French could, then it's pretty easy to come up with a numerical example to show the English and the French can have more sweaters and wine per capita if they each focus on the area where they have the absolute advantage and then trade. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But that still leaves open the possibility of say, wait a minute, what if our workers are so much more productive than those workers in some backward country that whether we're talking about sweaters or bottles of wine, our workers can make more units of either good per hour than the workers in that other, poor country where they don't have a lot of equipment and factories and things like that. So just from the arguments in Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's book, it wouldn't be so obvious that trade with that country would make your people better off. It would certainly make the people in the poor country better off because they would have access, to your superior production techniques and so on and productivity. But it's not obvious that you would be better off. And so the way economists nowadays motivate that is they say, classical free trade, it still works. It still makes both countries richer per capita, even in a case where one country has the advantage in terms of absolute advantage in every good. And so what happens is, and again, we'll hit this again when we discuss Ricardo, is that the country, what you end up doing is you say, okay, in which of those goods, so here we're talking about sweaters and bottles of wine, in which of those goods is the advantage of the English laborers even higher or the highest if we have more than two goods? And then that's what they should focus on and produce more of those things and then trade some of the surplus to the other country in exchange for the thing where the other country's disadvantage is the smallest. So the analogy, people often make analogies to individuals, and that's how you can motivate comparative advantage. So like Michael Jordan maybe can cut his lawn faster than the teenage kid down the street, right? Because Jordan's real tall and athletic and strong, and so with a given lawnmower, Michael Jordan can cut his lawn, in half an hour, and it takes the kid down the street an hour and 15 minutes to cut the same lawn. And so you might think, so therefore clearly Michael Jordan doesn't benefit from hiring the kid to cut his lawn because Jordan can do it faster. But that's silly. Michael Jordan is way, way, way better at playing basketball than the kid down the street. And so the way for Jordan to maximize his output is to hire that kid to cut the lawn, and then Jordan spends more time playing basketball. Okay, so now don't quibble with I think I got that from Greg Mankiw, that general example. You can quibble and say, well, wait a minute, couldn't Jordan just play the most the NBA would hire him, and then he'd still have time left over to cut his lawn? Yeah, sure, but come on, you get what I'm trying to say. All right. So that's the point is, though, and again, we'll hit that again more carefully when we get to Ricardo. That is traditionally considered to be the contribution of Ricardo because it was spelled out quite nicely and eloquently and methodically in Ricardo's treatment. So people, read Wealth of Nations, this is great. Adam Smith really blew up those mercantilists, huh? And then Ricardo comes along and shows, whoa, the case for free trade is even stronger than what Smith showed us. Even if you had a country that was superior in everything, it would still make sense for it to reduce or eliminate its trade barriers that were keeping out imports from some country where those workers were worse at everything, right? So it just extended the power of the classical argument in favor of free trade, and that historically was credited to being David Ricardo's contribution, and nowadays some people are saying, actually, could be that James Mill was the one who really developed this, and then he just taught it to Ricardo, and then it ended up in Ricardo's book, and Mill, being the great guy that he was and the modest guy that he was, didn't care and didn't run around saying, whoa, wait a minute, why are you guys saying David Ricardo did that? I was the one who came up with it. Okay, what about political activism? So James Mill was a cadre man, that's Rothbard's term, who wrote a lot of newspaper articles and essays on radical strategy, and he developed libertarian class analysis. All right, so what Rothbard means there, let me read to you an excerpt. So here I'm reading from Rothbard's discussion of James Mill. Rothbard says, Never has libertarian ruling class theory been put more clearly or forcefully than in the words of Mill. There are two classes, Mill declared. Quote, the first class, those who plunder, are the small number. They are the ruling few. The second class, those who are plundered, are the great number. They are the subject many. End quote. And then, so now I'm back to Rothbard talking. Or, as Professor Hamburger summed up Mill's position, quote, politics was a struggle between two classes, the avaricious rulers and their intended victims. Okay, so when we talk about class analysis, of course, in the Marxist tradition, it had to do with the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. But in the libertarian tradition, Rothbard thinks, yeah, class analysis is fine, just draw the boundaries correctly. It's not between different socioeconomic groups necessarily, the way a Marxist would look at it. It's rather looking at the ruling class, the political ruling class, and their cronies, the people connected to them who get favors from the state, versus everybody else who's, so it's like the parasite preying on the productive citizens in the voluntary sector. So whether you're a multimillionaire or a worker who punches a clock or, from 9 to 5, in Rothbard's view, as long as you were both in the voluntary private sector and were paying taxes at gunpoint, you were the ones being exploited. You were the victims. So James Mill developed that. He didn't invent it necessarily, but he certainly developed that framework. And so when Rothbard, uses a lot of terms that we normally can associate with Marxist, and again, Rothbard said that in a sense, James Mill was the Lenin to the Marx of either Bentham or Ricardo, that clearly Rothbard is saying because that's the way Mill viewed things. So Mill wanted to do what he could to advance radical liberty just the way a lot of communists would do what they could to advance communism. One of James Mill, so it wasn't merely that Mill wrote scholarly treatises or even that he just tutored his son or other more famous figures. He also engaged in a lot of political activism. And so he, for example, drove through Parliament the Reform Bill of 1832, which expanded suffrage to the middle class base. Okay, this idea of a general glut. So James Mill had, and here this is the opinion of George Reisman, the best defense of what we now call Say's law. In other words, the notion that there could not be a, quote, general glut. All right, and then John Stuart Mill would later concede too much on this topic in the view of Reisman. All right, so this is kind of a complicated topic. It gets very subtle very quickly. So just as we wind down this particular lecture, let me just give you the big picture, and we're going to come back to this when we discuss J.B. Say. So this idea of a general glut, what does that mean? Well, a glut is a surplus. Right? A glut means there's too many goods sitting in the hands of merchants. They can't get rid of it. So, and this is what happens when there's a recession, or as they might have called it, a depression or a panic back then. Right? That, man, all these merchants are showing up to market. They've got goods that have been produced, and they can't get buyers for it. And so the stuff sits on the shelves, and then they, of course, lay off workers or, cut their own orders from the warehouse or the wholesalers, and then it's a vicious downward spiral. And that's the kind of thing that political economists back then would be scratching their heads saying, why does this keep happening periodically? And what can the government or some other entity do so that this doesn't keep happening? Because this isn't good when people get thrown out of work and merchants can't sell their stuff. Why does this keep happening? So one very common way of characterizing the problem is to say there is a general glut. Just in general, there are too many goods being brought to market that can't be sold. And so there's two different ways of viewing that. One, you could say there was general overproduction. Just in general, producers made too much stuff. Or you could diagnose the problem from the flip side and say there's not enough demand. There's a general underconsumption. right? Consumers and other, business people who are investing, for some reason, they're not spending enough. They're not trying to buy as much stuff, right? Because what the glut means is that there's a mismatch. There's more stuff for sale than people want to buy. And so those are two different ways of analyzing the problem. So according to Reisman, that's all poppycock, that in a freely functioning market economy with prices that are allowed to adjust, you can't have a general glut. And again, this is what's going to be called Say's law. And that's how most economists today would think about that. So there were a lot of economists. So Ricardo and Malthus argued about this, and James Mill has a whole essay on it. And so what I've included for you guys in the course readings is James Mill's discussion of this, where he walks through the arguments by which you would say, okay, really, as long as the government's not interfering with the price mechanism, there really couldn't be a general glut. That doesn't make sense to say that producers in general are showing up to market with too many goods, and that's the problem. And gee, if only they would produce less, then we would fix this. Or on the other hand, to say, yeah, it's just, man, for some reason people aren't spending enough and trying to consume as much. That's the problem. That James Mill is going to try to argue why that's doesn't make sense, and that's not really a good way of diagnosing the problem. And according to Reisman, that's the best exposition of this viewpoint, even better than what Say himself wrote when he discusses the operation of markets, in which we nowadays refer to as Say's law. So last thing I'll mention on this is that modern historians of economic thought would often say that this position was true in certain circumstances, but in general it's not true. Okay, so Keynes famously said that Say's law is not true, and that was the way that Keynes distinguished his own general theory from what he thought was the more specific theory of the classical economists. And so that's one way of that modern Keynesians will express themselves, as they might say, oh, under such and such assumptions, then Say's law holds and markets clear and you don't get large-scale involuntary unemployment. But we know, because we're good economists and we're not ideological, that Say's law in general does not hold, and we can imagine, for example, that there is an excess demand for the money commodity. And then if people in general are trying to demand more of the money commodity than there is money to go around, then on the flip side, that means there could be a general glut in all the other commodities, the real goods and services that are being brought to market. And John Stuart Mill wrote some stuff that basically admitted that. And so, again, modern economists would probably, on this issue, say, yeah, the classical economists originally were a little bit too sweeping in their statements, and then it took the sharp mind of John Stuart Mill to come along and it correctly characterize it and show that you could imagine there being a general glut in terms of real goods and services with a shortage of money. And so you can see how that, if that's what you think is happening, you can see how that would give rise to a bunch of Keynesian policy prescriptions. So George Reisman, who is a super capitalist and someone who rejects Keynesianism, says, what happened in the history of economic thought was James Mill had this wonderful defense of what we now call Say's law, and his son screwed it up. So with that, I will stop there, and we will see you next time.